This is a video I took of a protest in Brazil way back in 2013 from the balcony of my apartment. It wasn't a particularly important protest, but rather just one in a series of nationwide demonstrations that struck the country that year. So, I was originally born in Brazil, but had spent a large majority of my life in the US before moving back there at age 11. Suddenly, I was away from the country that I knew and loved, and in this unfamiliar place that everyone told me was supposed to be home. I was 11 years old and had little to no concept of politics, let alone political demonstrations. Little did I know how tumultuous and eventful Brazil's history had been. Yet here I was witnessing something I wouldn't comprehend until years later. I love American history, but learning about Brazil has always intimidated me. Its history and politics seem so complex, and I feel like I've barely even scratched the surface of American history despite spending years studying it. I want to make more of an effort to learn about Brazilian history, and in this video I'm going to do so through one of my favorite subjects, the presidency. By examining the last 5 presidents of Brazil, the only ones to have become chief executives under its modern system, we can better understand modern Brazilian history and how the country got to where it is today. Or maybe American politics just looked so rough that I had to switch countries. Fernando Henrique Cardoso served as president of Brazil from 1995 until 2002, making me a Cardoso baby. He was born in Rio de Janeiro on June 18, 1931, and studied sociology at the University of São Paulo, eventually getting his doctorate and becoming a professor at the school in 1958. As an academic, FHC sought to modernize the education system, an aspiration which led him to be persecuted by the military dictatorship which had taken power in 1964. FHC would take political exile in Chile and France before returning to Brazil in 1968. Cardoso's area of academic focus during this time was the relationship between developing countries and the West, a subject that would go on to define his entire life. Upon his return, the government took away FHC's political rights and his ability to teach. Shortly after, he founded the Brazilian Center of Analysis and Planning, which took a pragmatic approach to assessing the state of Brazil and how it could be improved. During this time, he became a professor at various Western universities, including Princeton and Cambridge, using his platform to oppose the regime and advocate for democracy in Brazil. In 1974, Ulisses Guimarães, president of the MDB, known today as the PMDB, or Brazilian Democratic Movement Party, invited Cardoso to help draft the party's platform. FHC would become senator from São Paulo in 1983. You might be wondering, how was he a senator during a dictatorship? Well, dog, is complicated. Repression by the dictatorship peaked during the 1970s, with redemocratization gaining traction by the end of the decade. The regime had been allowing elections for a few years, though their legitimacy was always questionable, and even then the country's most powerful office, the presidency, was always under military rule. The regime had always allowed some form of opposition, though it was becoming too much for them to bear. One of the most important factions of the opposition was the labor movement, including one charismatic young leader named Lula, who might be going places. An economic crisis in the 1980s accelerated the democratic movement. From 1984 to 1985, FHC was one of the leading politicians of the Direita Já movement, which roughly translates to direct now. This movement united broad coalitions from across the political spectrum to advocate for direct presidential elections. FHC became Minister of Finance under President Itamar Franco, where he became known to the Brazilian people for the Plano Real, which got inflation under control.
A inflação real está nascendo a sua moeda.
FHC would run for the presidency himself in 1994, where he won during the first round of the election with 54% of the vote. In an era of political and economic reform, the Cardoso administration dealt with one major question: how much should government get involved? As president, he would institute various neoliberal policies such as privatization. He also tried to bring over aspects of business administration over to the administration of government, which led to decentralization education, and further cooperation between state and local governments. Cardoso was expected to serve only one term as set out in the Brazilian Constitution, but an amendment which allowed for the re-election of mayors, governors, and presidents was added after a referendum in 1997. FHC's time in office is known for its economic stability and reform, being the first president in the modern electoral system. The former president is still alive and kicking, giving random interviews about politics and world affairs. Cardoso will do these in English sometimes, and I've noticed Brazilians often commenting on just how bad his English is.
Politics in Brazil is a risky business, see? Risky business, see?
He also joined a group called the Elders, composed of former heads of state such as Nelson Mandela and Jimmy Carter, aimed at improving human rights across the globe. Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, Brazil's once and future president who left office with a 90% approval rating before being thrown in prison and making one of the biggest political comebacks of all time. Lula had a very poor upbringing in the city of São Paulo, at one point sharing a 2-bedroom house with 27 other people. His father saw school as useless, and the young boy would drop out of the 5th grade to help the family with bills. The future president had no interest in politics despite coming of age during the rise of the military dictatorship. It was through his experience as a factory worker that his political interest finally bloomed. During this time, Lula lost one of his fingers in a work-related accident. My mom told me that people will joke that Lula steals a little bit less because he only has 9 fingers. The terrible working conditions and laughable wages pushed Lula to get involved in the labor movement, where he became president of the Metal Workers Union and a famous activist. The future president led a series of strikes from 1978 to 1980, which would culminate in him being arrested and indicted for violating national security law. He was a founding member of the Partido de Trabalhadores, or Workers' Party. His first foray into political office was a run for the governorship of São Paulo in 1982, where he finished in 4th place. In the following years, he would advocate strongly for direct presidential elections. Lula made his first run for the presidency all the way back in 1989, which is actually a year after Joe Biden's first presidential run. He ran again in 1994 and 1998, finishing in 2nd place to FHC before finally winning in 2002 under a more pragmatic platform with 61.5% of the vote.
Eu vou votar no Lula, do PT. Porque já tá há 8 anos o mesmo governo e só piorando cada vez o Brasil. Para mim, a única mudança é o Lula só. Senão vai continuar a mesma coisa.
Eu acho que ele é muito comunista, entendeu? Aí eu não vou votar nele, não. Eu nunca gostei do PT.
Lula's background was different from any other Brazilian presidents, a factory worker with no formal education, an extremely charismatic leader who talked straight to the people with a socialist platform. Lula's most notable act in office was the introduction of Bolsa Família, which gave money to families in poverty. Families could receive additional funds for each child they had as long as they were up to date with vaccines, stayed in school, and didn't engage in child labor. By the end of Lula's term in 2010, 12.4 million households were enrolled in the program. Lula also more than doubled the minimum wage, going from 200 reais a month to 510. His administration also saw the creation of 13 million new jobs. Lula ended up not being as left-leaning as some people had expected. Despite his strong criticism of the FHC administration, he continued his International Monetary Fund program. There were accusations of corruption and bribes leveled toward Lula starting in 2005, which hurt his popularity. Brazil's Supreme Court would later rule that none of these cases against Lula were credible. Dilma Rousseff was born in Belo Horizonte, Minas Gerais in 1947 to a Bulgarian immigrant father and a Brazilian mother. In her youth, she became involved in a left-wing anti-dictatorship guerrilla group known as the National Liberation Command, Comando de Libertação Nacional. A raid on a Rio de Janeiro militant safe house Dilma and her husband were staying at resulted in police fatalities, leading them to flee the state. Her activities with the group led to her being captured and tortured in 1970. She wouldn't be released until 3 years later, after which she finally completed her college education. As the dictatorship waned, Rousseff got her start in local government, becoming Minister of Finance for the city of Porto Alegre in 1986. She then became Secretary of Mines and Energy for the state of Rio Grande do Sul before rising to that position nationally upon Lula's election. Dilma wasn't associated with the Workers' Party until 1999, but she rose quickly within its ranks, eventually becoming Lula's chief of staff and chair of the massive state-run oil company Petrobras, which I'm sure will have no relevance to Dilma's dramatic political downfall whatsoever. Brazil's president can only serve 2 consecutive terms at a time, which meant that Lula would be leaving office, at least temporarily. It became clear very quickly that Dilma was Lula's chosen successor. The then president violated an impartiality rule by openly campaigning for his chief of staff on television, resulting in her campaign being fined. During this run, Dilma attributed Brazil's problems to the Cardoso administration and its successes to Lula's, promising to continue the Bolsa Família program. In 2010, Brazil had a 7.5% GDP growth rate, which fell to just 1% in 2012. In response, the central bank aggressively reduced interest rates, which helped keep Dilma's approval rating high. Despite this, in 2013, the country was hit with a massive wave of protests, some of which became violent. The Brazilian middle class had become increasingly disillusioned by government corruption and flailing public service at a time where the country was using its tax dollars to build and repair soccer stadiums for the 2014 World Cup and 2016 Olympics. Dilma's approval rating fell from 65% to 30% in 2013 alone. That same year, Edward Snowden revealed that US intelligence had been monitoring Rousseff's emails, which contributed to a growing strain between the two countries, including a canceled state visit to Washington and even Dilma speaking out against US spying activities.
The permanent mission of Brazil with the United Nations and even the very presidency of the Republic of Brazil were subject to interception of communications. Meddling in such a manner in the life and affairs of other countries is a breach of international law, and as such, it is an affront to the principles that should otherwise govern relations among countries, especially among friendly nations.
Once the World Cup came around, it was actually very popular and gave Dilma a polling boost despite Brazil losing to Germany in an embarrassing 7-1 defeat. I don't really care about soccer, but I was living in Brazil at the time, and watching this happen live with my entire extended family was something that I will never forget. Even in her first year in office, Rousseff's administration was surrounded by corruption allegations, which led to the resignation of 5 cabinet ministers who held onto their posts from the Lula administration. The most famous, or should I say infamous, part of Dilma's time in office was Operação Lava Jato, or Operation Car Wash. I constantly heard family members talking about this and posting about it on social media, but my interest in American politics had just barely started and it hadn't really spread to Brazilian politics yet. This, combined with living in the United States, left me pretty confused on the scandal and honestly just not really understanding what was going on. At the time, Brazil's state-run oil company Petrobras was the biggest company in all of Latin America. What follows is one of the most consequential scandals in modern political history, bringing down not just one but 2 Brazilian presidents. Starting at the end of the Lula administration, investigators discovered that contracts were being inflated by up to 3%, which would be funneled back to the 3 parties that made up the ruling coalition at the time, including the Workers' Party. This brought the government to a standstill because bribery and kickbacks were a large part of how coalitions came together. The country's economy also took a hit because of the suspension of Petrobras contracts amid the scandal, with 61% of Petrobras' 276,000 employees losing their jobs in the first 2 years. Judge Sérgio Moro rose to political stardom as Dilma's most famous accuser. While Rousseff was not directly implicated in the scandal, most of the wrongdoing took place while she was Minister of Energy and Chief of Staff to Lula, which led many to think she was at least aware of the wrongdoing even if she didn't take any bribes herself. She was also accused of obstructing justice by appointing Lula to be her Chief of Staff, which protected him from prosecution. This appointment was blocked by a federal judge who released a recording of a wiretapped phone call between the two, which points to the appointment being a precautionary method to protect Lula. The impeachment charges made against Dilma accused her government of taking loans from state banks without congressional approval, which she denies, saying that it was a transfer instead of a loan. These details honestly get pretty muddled, but whether you support or oppose Dilma, I think it's difficult to say that there wasn't any political motivation behind her impeachment. Rousseff was unpopular, and the Brazilian public was unsatisfied with her leadership. Many have described the Dilma impeachment as a coup, including the former president herself. Though the impeachment was on shaky grounds, it was within the rule of law. Dilma had full legal representation, and the military wasn't involved.
Brazil is Latin America's largest economy with an annual GDP of $1.9 trillion, but it shrank 3.8% last year. Political upheaval will breed fresh uncertainty, but those pushing for the impeachment say Rousseff needs to go if Brazil is to see growth once more.
In some ways, her impeachment seems more like a vote of no confidence, replacing a leftist president with a center-right one without the need for those pesky elections. As for Lula, he sought to make a comeback by running for a third, non-consecutive term as president of Brazil in the 2018 election, while at the same time facing criminal prosecution related to Operation Car Wash. Lula, of course, argued that these charges were bogus and politically motivated.
Como eu considero esse processo ilegítimo e a denúncia uma farsa, eu tô aqui em respeito à lei, em respeito à nossa Constituição.
His wife Marisa would sadly pass away in February of 2017 following a stroke. She had been called to stand trial alongside her husband in September of the previous year. In July of 2017, Lula would be found guilty of money laundering and corruption, ultimately being sentenced to almost 10 years in prison. But something tells me we will hear from Lula again later in the video. Michel Temer was born to Lebanese immigrants in the state of São Paulo on September 23, 1943. He studied law and would even become a constitutional law professor himself before entering politics. He held various positions in São Paulo's state government between the 1960s and 1980s, eventually becoming its attorney general. He became a prominent member of the Brazilian Democratic Movement Party, or PMDB. He was elected to Brazil's lower house of Congress in 1986 and served 3 terms as its speaker. Temer built up a reputation in Congress as a backroom negotiator who wasn't especially well known to the Brazilian people, apart from having a wife 40 years his junior. In the midst of the corruption scandal, Temer began publicly distancing himself from Rousseff, and the PMDB even left their governing coalition in March of 2016. On May 12th, Dilma was formally suspended from the presidency as the impeachment process proceeded. Michel Temer then became acting president of Latin America's largest country following Dilma's removal. Temer was seen as a pro-market president who championed posterity after 13 years of Workers' Party rule. He didn't exactly receive a warm welcome to the presidency. Temer's administration was immediately swept up in its own corruption allegations related to Operation Car Wash and hush money payments, which also included more damaging recordings. In June, charges were brought against Temer before Congress, but only 227 out of the 513 deputies voted in favor of trying the president, far from the 2/3 necessary. That same month, Brazil's highest electoral court even threatened to annul the Rousseff Temer election results and remove him from office because of campaign finance issues, though the court ultimately voted 4-3 in favor of dismissing the case. Do you see why this video took so long to get to? In July of 2017, Lula was convicted of money laundering and corruption charges relating to the Petrobras scandal.
Resultado fabuloso, resultado maravilhoso, já era esperado isso. 3-0 melhor ainda, não podia haver divergência, como não existe no consenso hoje do Brasil, que não existe dúvida.
Sempre que vejo uma perseguição ferrenha em cima do PT, do Lula, né, uma injustiça tremenda, ao mesmo tempo eu vejo que cometeram erros e têm que ser responsabilizados por isso.
Despite this, the former president was the clear frontrunner as the 2018 election was approaching. Jair Bolsonaro was born on March 21st, 1955 in the state of São Paulo. He attended an army prep school and graduated from Agulhas Negras Military Academy. He would then have a 17-year military career where he eventually earned the rank of captain. Bolsonaro would leave the military in 1988 and be elected to the Rio de Janeiro City Council the following year. Most of the future president's political career was in the lower house of Brazil's Congress, where he served 7 terms from 1997 until his rise to the presidency. Throughout his entire political career, Bolsonaro embraced very conservative social positions, which has gotten him a fair amount of ridicule.
Eu sou favorável à tortura, tu sabe disso.
Nós não, o povo, a sociedade brasileira não gosta de homossexual. A cultura é diferente da nossa. Agora, nós não estamos preparados ainda, no Brasil, porque nem um pai, nem você, nem eu, tem orgulho de ter um filho gay. Orgulho, prazer, fazer festa, Porque apareceu um filho gay na
If the
família.
child is happy.
Isso, porque o filho começa a ficar meio assim, meio gayzinho, leva um couro, ele muda o comportamento dele. Jamais estuprar você que você não merece.
Olha, eu espero que não.
Se é esse o papo, dá, eu te dou outra. Dá que 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 eu te dou outra.
Mas o que é isso?
Você me chamou de estuprador? Você me chamou de estuprador? Você é uma imoral. Tá, vagabunda.
In the aftermath of the biggest scandal in Brazil's history, Bolsonaro sought to make a populist bid for the presidency, one that would capitalize on anger towards politicians and elites going against the status quo. You don't need me to tell you that Bolsonaro channeled Trump. That commentary seems to follow him anytime he's talked about in US media. Despite being in prison, former President Lula was making a bid to return to office where he actually maintained a pretty sizable lead over his opponent, even if he was behind bars. In August of 2018, Brazil's highest federal court barred Lula's candidacy and he was replaced by his running mate Fernando Haddad. Just a few days later, Bolsonaro was stabbed in the stomach while campaigning in a failed assassination attempt. This event gave Bolsonaro a martyr image that likely boosted his chances. He would go on to win the presidency on the second round of voting with roughly 55% of the vote, compared to Haddad's 45%. As president, Bolsonaro sought to reform Brazil's national pension system, ultimately raising the retirement age by 9 years. He also weakened regulations protecting the Amazon rainforest. This made Bolsonaro quite popular with the business community, which sought to harness the Amazon's vast resources. In mid-2019, extreme forest fires struck the area, which resulted in a large backlash from the Brazilian people and the international community. He ultimately sent in 44,000 members of the Brazilian military to help put out the fires, along with instituting a 60-day ban on the use of fire to clear land. Bolsonaro was also widely criticized for his response, or rather lack thereof, to the COVID-19 pandemic. As president, Bolsonaro downplayed the virus and cast doubt on protective measures such as masks and social distancing, as well as vaccines. Bolsonaro himself would often be seen breaking COVID protocol. Likely as a consequence of this, the president would catch COVID in July of 2020. He was also criticized for the slow rollout of their vaccination program. Continuing his Trumpian streak, Bolsonaro began to cast doubt upon the legitimacy of the results in the upcoming presidential election. If you don't know by now, Bolsonaro was being challenged by former President Lula, who sought once again to make a political comeback following the annulment of his corruption convictions. Though the election was incredibly close, Lula would ultimately come out on top with 50.9% of the vote compared to Bolsonaro's 49.1% in the second round of voting. On January 8th, 2023, Bolsonaro supporters would stage their own version of the January 6th insurrection attempt, with similarly disastrous results. They did it a whole week after Lula was sworn in though, which is kind of funny. In June of 2023, Bolsonaro was barred from running for president again until 2030 due to his unfounded claims of a fraudulent election. Following his loss, Bolsonaro could be seen wandering around Florida in random Publix grocery stores. I'm not even kidding. I know multiple people that just ran into him and took pictures with him, which is honestly just so funny to me. It's incredible just how much Lula has been a central figure, and often even the central figure in Brazilian politics. First coming to prominence in the 1970s, first running for president in 1989, serving as president for 8 years, having his chosen successor elected to 2 terms, before falling out of favor, going to prison, and having someone elected in direct opposition to him before coming back and winning the presidency once again. Brazilian politics is wild, man. Thank you so much for watching. If you made it to the end of the video, please consider liking, subscribing, or even turning on that little bell notification button. That's something that YouTubers are supposed to say, right? You can even support me through a YouTube channel membership or Patreon if you are feeling generous. I'm throwing up all the appropriate shoutouts right here next to me. Let me know what kind of video you want to see next, if you want to see other Brazil videos or other international videos in general. See you guys later.